Hello and welcome to another video review. This is Command & Conquer Renegade for PC. This is a first-person shooter by Westwood Studios and published by EA back in February of 2002, and it's interesting for a couple of reasons. The first of which being, it says Command & Conquer, and yet it's an FPS. You don't think of an FPS when you think Command & Conquer, and these days if we were to apply, say, an FPS to Command & Conquer, people would cry heresy, and there would be all sorts of just wailing and gnashing of teeth. Back then, not so much. People were surprisingly open to the idea. But up to this point, Westwood had never made a first-person shooter, so we didn't really know what to expect from it, and we had no idea how it would even tie into Command & Conquer at all. What we did know when it finally came out was that it got a fair amount of praise. A lot of people generally liked it, especially for its multiplayer. Now, unfortunately, I cannot speak from experience on actually having played the multiplayer. I have played multiplayer practice, but not the multiplayer itself. So I do have a general idea of how it would play out, but I do not have actual multiplayer experience, so that is something to keep in mind here when I'm going through this review. But that said, let's go ahead and get started. Find out how this thing actually is. Well, as far as presentation goes, it doesn't look all that great by today's standards, obviously, because it came out in 2002 and it was a 3D game that has aged considerably. But back when this was released, it looked alright, at the very least, particularly with regards to how open the environments are, and there's a decent amount of detail on things, although it certainly reeks of its time with a lot of blocky models and not particularly great animations that are kind of clunky looking. But it certainly doesn't look horrible, and the fact that it's colorful really does help it out in that regard. Because, let's face it, it's refreshing to have anything colorful at this point, when pretty much everything has to be brown and gray and realistic. So there is that, but it's definitely something you'll have to get past if you're going to try this thing out. But then there's the sound design, which is kind of all over the place. On the one hand, it doesn't have particularly good music, which is pretty surprising given that Command & Conquer before this had great soundtracks, if nothing else. And here it's pretty average at best, but mostly fairly mediocre. So they didn't really do a particularly great job with that. And then you get to the sound effects, which feel very stock in a lot of spots, and other spots they just don't feel good at all. For example, the sounds for the chain gun and the assault rifle just don't sound good at all. Meanwhile, the sniper rifle doesn't sound particularly powerful. It sounds okay, but obviously the ramjet rifle sounds more powerful. And some of the laser weapons, for example, are kind of annoying to shoot, actually, because they just have this really loud noise that they emit that's just kind of hurts your ears, actually. So the sound effects really aren't that good either, but then you get to the voice acting, and it's cheesy and not too bad, actually. It certainly helps that they kind of ham it up a bit, but ultimately the performances are just kind of bland and uninteresting. It really doesn't help that the writing in this game really doesn't do all that much for it, so they're doing what they can with what they've got, and hamming it up certainly helps, but ultimately the presentation was just not all that great, even when it came out. If anything, the only really impressive thing about it was the fact that it had fairly wide open environments, but that's ultimately not really enough to bring the presentation above anything beyond average. But ultimately, it's not the presentation that really matters here. What really matter are the story and the gameplay, and the story in this takes place during the First Tiberium War, which, if you don't know, is the events of the original Command & Conquer. And you take the role of Captain Nick Parker, who is known as Havoc, who is a GDI commando. And you are sent on a mission to track down some Tiberium research specialists who have been abducted. And from there, it goes into a pretty generic plot involving the Nod forces trying to create enhanced super soldiers with this Tiberium research, and you're just trying to stop it. It doesn't really do much for the game, and really doesn't serve as much other than a general background to what you're doing. They do try to throw in a bit of extra stuff with the Dead Six, which is Havoc's team, and they try to throw in some drama here and there, but it really just comes across as forced, and the story itself honestly feels like it's just there to have a single-player campaign and nothing else. Because especially when you go into the gameplay of the single player, it becomes readily apparent that Westwood basically had no idea what they were doing from a single player FPS campaign standpoint. Most of the missions involve you going from point A to point B, slaughtering every nod in your way, and that's pretty much it. You'll of course get side objectives that are basically just go and find a thing or save some civilians or whatever, and it really doesn't change what you're doing, which is going through these surprisingly empty levels, finding a few nod here and there to fight, and not really doing a lot else other than maybe driving a vehicle for the particularly big maps, or just getting lost in this kind of labyrinthine level design at certain points. It honestly gets really boring really quickly, and none of this is helped by the enemy AI being extremely stupid, where they basically just run directly at you and open fire and don't really do much else. Occasionally you'll encounter enemies that hang back and try to pick you off from a distance, but they're really easy to take out, so you really don't have any trouble with the AI in general. And of course, it's not like your friendly AI can help all that much either. They're really no better than the enemy AI. So you're dealing with stupidity across the board and really uninspired, bland level design that ends up just being really boring. And you would think that these moments where, for example, you drive a mammoth tank or any number of things like that would be really cool and entertaining, but they really aren't in the single-player campaign. So what you're going to turn to, and what the real draw of this game is the multiplayer. Now this is where things actually get really interesting, because they take ideas from the previous Command & Conquer games and implement them in a way that makes this really stand out from pretty much every other FPS on the market. Now, you start out and you're just a simple soldier, but you can buy different kits. Now, each of these loadouts is actually going to give you not only a different weapon, but also, on occasion, it will give you different amounts of the C4 that you can use to destroy structures. It will give you repair tools, which double as, obviously, repair tools and also weapons. And you always have your suppressed pistol with infinite ammo, so you can always fall back on that if you need to. But this is where team play is going to come in, because not only can you buy these different loadouts, but you can also buy vehicles, and you can buy strike beacons for your particularly powerful attack, like the ion cannon or the nuclear strike. And your objective is basically to go over to the enemy base and just wipe it out completely. That's your objective. It's easier said than done, however, if you've actually got anything resembling a competent team on one side or the other. Now, what I'm showing you here is multiplayer practice, which is the offline against bots mode, which basically is just there to get you used to the general mechanics. It's really not a challenge whatsoever, because the enemy AI is still incredibly stupid, so it's still incredibly easy to take the enemy base out. But what you end up doing is getting your forces together. Maybe you'll get a couple of vehicles together and you might go in and try to eliminate the enemy base's defenses before sending in the troops, who will just get completely annihilated by either the Obelisk of Light or the Advanced Guard Tower. So the first priority is to neutralize that and then go after the other structures, because you can't really get into the base if you are trying to deal with this guard tower. So as you keep going, you'll just gradually accrue credits, and as you earn these credits, you'll get access to more and more powerful or more and more nuanced classes. For example, you'll eventually get access to someone with a ramjet rifle, and this is just a really powerful sniper rifle, so they will hang back and try to pick off enemy targets, particularly the powerful ones, because those can really mess up your forces if you're just running in with a lot of soldiers or engineers or whatever. And so you have this kind of cool dynamic where you have a sort of combined arms, but you also have this base aspect, which is really what sets it apart. It's really not like any other multiplayer FPS I've played. There are elements that are similar, but nothing with this specific combination. And it's really cool. But unfortunately, like I said, I have never actually played the multiplayer itself. The idea is what's cool to me. Now, what I have played multiplayer of is the Renegade X beta from way back when it was barely even playable, and it was still pretty cool. Now, Renegade X is a remake of this, at least the multiplayer component, on the Unreal Engine. So if you're interested in the multiplayer, I would recommend trying that out because you're going to have a better chance of finding people actually playing it. In this particular case, the game has been out for so long that there's basically no player base for it. There's still a very dedicated fan community, but it's very small at this point. So I don't even know if it's possible to get games running with this thing anymore. If I remember correctly, it did use GameSpy, which shut down. So you might need to do some finagling to actually get the multiplayer to work. But ultimately, Renegade is a weird game. On the one hand, the single player is pretty awful. It's just incredibly tedious, incredibly boring, and really does not do anything for this particular game. The multiplayer, on the other hand, is a really cool concept, and I can see it being lots of fun if you can manage to get a game going on it. But that's pretty iffy at this point. So ultimately, I'm giving this a 2 out of 5, but keep in mind, that's mostly because of the single player. The multiplayer is really interesting, but it's just basically impossible to get a game going. So I can't really count that in very well, unfortunately. It's one of those games where back in the day it was really cool, but with time it's just lost its magic. Although there are attempts to fix that with things like Renegade X, so you might want to check that out instead. Thanks for watching.